Welcome back to another episode of the Quillette Cetera podcast. You're with me, Zoe Booth, and today I'm speaking with Associate Professor Josh Roose. Josh is one of Australia's leading experts on violent extremism and political radicalisation. Based at Deakin University's Alfred Deakin Institute, Dr. Roose has spent the past decade researching how extremist movements, from jihadist networks to far-right militias and online incel forums, exploit disillusioned young men. His work focuses on the ways in which masculinity, identity, and ideology intersect in the digital age, and how these forces can draw ordinary individuals towards extraordinary violence. In today's conversation, we talk about Josh's first book, which was studying Muslim men in Australia. We talk about how many people, both men and women, have quite soft misogynistic opinions of women, and maybe I'm one of them. I don't know. We'll find out. We also talk about what individuals in their home and governments can do to foster a pro-social idea of masculinity, to empower men to be happy, healthy individuals. We also talk about how masculinity has been demonized in many ways over the past few decades. If these topics sound interesting to you, stay tuned. At the end, if you like the conversation, please share it widely. It would mean a lot to me. And my apologies, due to a technical error, the last few minutes of this podcast have been lost. So when it ends abruptly, you'll know why. Without much further ado, let's get into this conversation with Associate Professor Josh Roose. To start with, what got you interested in studying masculinity and political extremism?
I've always been interested in religious and political violence, and 9/11 for me was a driver. I was 21. I remember it happening, going, this is going to shape the world for the next 50 years. Hence my journey began into understanding and my intellectual journey, but also the research. And I went and joined the Army Reserves and sort of, get my head around what was going on in the world.
So that prompted you to join the Army?
Yeah, it did.
Wow.
For many reasons, I think I felt that everyone should be able to, at some point, defend their country at the very least. And I think for me, it was a brilliant experience. I miss it now, but I'm old and broken, and so I'm probably not in the position to do what I'd like to do with it. But I think for me, I simultaneously started a PhD looking at political Islam, and that paralleled my journey with the army as well.
Yeah, so that was your first book in 2015 on Australian Muslim men, is that correct?
Yeah. So a long journey. I mean, I spent a lot of time doing army stuff and not doing my PhD, and then I finally got it done. And as most people would know, a book might come out 3 or 4 years after you finish your PhD, by the time you've gotten around to writing it and everything else. But so I brought masculinity into that because it struck me that there was this big focus in the scholarship on Muslim women and agency and so on, but no one was really looking at the fact that Muslim men and masculinity in particular was largely neglected. So I wanted to understand why some young men were doing really positive things, contributing to their society, and others were going down such dark paths, particularly when they often came from the same families, attended the same mosques, often knew each other. And I wanted to really sort of try to dissect, well, what was driving that? And to me, in particular, this sense of manhood and what it is to be a man resonated with me, having gone through private boys' schools, in the army, male-dominated rugby clubs, male-dominated institutions my whole life. And it struck me that there's something going on here that we haven't yet unpacked. And I was probably one of the very first to do it.
Fascinating. And did you find that Muslim men have a different masculine ideal to other cultures of men, for example, Anglo-Saxon, white guys in Australia?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's remarkable consistency with men across cultures in what matters to them, in that for the most part, being, a sense of honour, recognition, respect are important to all men and to women. But in particular, it's the way that plays out within cultures that's important. So it's important to remember that post 9/11 in particular, there was an enormous amount of scrutiny of Muslims in Western contexts. 9/11 wasn't just a standalone event. We saw Al-Qaeda globally, the Bali bombings. We saw 7/7, the London bombing, so the bus and the tube station, I think it was.
Madrid as well?
Yeah, Madrid 2004, I think. And it just seemed to be consistently sort of, developing and evolving on a global stage. And then we saw the Innocence of Muslims protests up in Sydney with young, primarily younger Muslim men engaged in violence with police. And then obviously the Islamic State emerged. And so within Islam in particular, there's a lot of dynamics that come into play. One is obviously not only the faith component, which again has some parallels with other faiths, but it's the emphasis on standing up and fighting and so on. And that's tied into the very concept of jihad. And so on the one hand, there's the inner struggle against the nafs or the spiritual temptation, which is meant to be the primary struggle. But what I saw was that in particular, Salafi jihadist types and preachers were seeking to mobilize the other component of jihad, which was to fight for the faith and to stand up. And that really became predominant for some of these men.
Can you explain what Salafi Islam is compared to other branches?
Sure. So there's Islam's basically broken into there's different forms, and it's to some extent a fluid concept, but primarily Sunni and Shia. About 90% of the world are Sunni, about 10% are Shia. So Iran is a Shia country, for example. Sunnis predominate in the Middle East and in the diasporas. And it's about the lineage of the Prophet. So Shias believe that the successor, the rightful caliph, is descended directly from the bloodline of the Prophet in very basic terms. And the Sunni faith or component is more about the intellectual lineage and following the rightful path of the predecessors and following the laws that developed around that time and so on. But then there was effectively a modernist approach that really took off over the last 100 years, but in particular in the last 50 or 60 years out of Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis and so on. And really, in a nutshell, what we saw was a puritanical form of Islam emerge, Sunni Islam, puritanical Sunni Islam, where context no longer mattered. And context has been critical to the spread of Islam because it adapts and evolves based on local context, this concept of urf. But when you go to the Puritans, their approach was you have to live as the Prophet did at that particular time. There's no excuse for context. You have to, all your beliefs, the way you wash yourself, it's incredibly prescriptive. Everything you do has to be effectively aligned with what we know about the time of the Prophet.
And that's Salafism?
That's effectively Salafism. There's different types of Salafism. There's a spiritual Salafism. Probably most Salafis are primarily spiritual and it's about their own faith and practice. Then there's political Salafis and Salafi jihadists.
So I assume you studied various groups of Muslims throughout Australia, or did you focus on certain groups?
So the PhD was ethnographic, so I spent a lot of time with young Muslim men from some of these backgrounds, including an entire chapter dedicated to Waleed Ali and learning his trajectory. And he had a fascinating trajectory to get where he was.
And for context, because a lot of our listeners are outside of Australia, Waleed Ali is probably the most famous Muslim Australian right now. He's on a TV show that was recently canned called The Project, but it was a pretty popular for a time being sort of dinner time chat show. So he's a journalist, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say he's probably one of the most famous journalists or, slash creators in the country.
True.
And he really came out of, he was actually at one point quite hardline and he evolved. So I really dug deep into what are the core features. And what I noticed, for example, within Islam, there's this spiritual tradition, tasawwuf, which is a Sufi form of Islam. And that there was a particularly well-known tasawwuf who had a group called Young Muslims Australia. And a lot of the leadership of the Muslim community gone through that, the more moderate types. So there was all these different dynamics at play. And in that research, I really sought to bring those into conversation with masculinity and what it is to be an Australian Muslim, from an outsider's perspective. But I then also looked at young men who'd gone off to fight with Islamic State and what their trajectories were as part of that first book. I then had two postdocs simultaneously, one at Monash, one at Western Sydney. So the one at Monash was looking at citizenship and Australian Muslims and young people. And the one in Sydney was amazing. It was looking at Sharia and legal pluralism and looking at this argument that we need to be able to accommodate different forms of legal practice and how does that work in reality? Highly controversial terrain. So I ended up doing field work with imams, community leaders, and Islamic lawyers and finance professionals in Sydney, but then got the opportunity to spend some time in New York doing that same research in Jersey and New York, which opened up a lot of doors over there.
Have you looked much into like dignity cultures versus honor cultures? And is it face cultures? I don't know. You're the sociologist, but I've read about it and it sounds interesting.
So I can't remember the authors, but there's a great article out there on honor and dignity cultures and so on. And I do actually draw upon that work myself. It's called Victimhood Cultures is the article. And so there's victimhood culture, dignity culture, and honor cultures. And so honor cultures are basically predicated on this notion of you hurt me, I'll hurt you, an eye for an eye. It's embedded in many of our religious traditions, at least in some religious traditions. And it's this idea of face and status and standing being incredibly important. And historically, that was incredibly important because if you didn't stand up for yourself, you were weak and you'd be crushed by an opposing tribe or so on. As societies have developed and not only just had things like high GDP and institutions have taken form and taken shape, and we've seen the evolution into dignity cultures. So as law enforcement, for example, has become institutionalized with police and other arms of government, you hurt me, I'm going to tell the authorities about it and we're going to deal with it through the courts. And I'll make it clear this is a very basic breakdown. And so you might harm me, but I'll go to the police and you might kill someone in my family, but I'm going to go through the courts and you're going to go to prison. So dignity is a key element of that culture. And what we've seen, so the article goes over time, and I think it makes some really interesting discussion, is the emergence with the internet and online world in particular, of victimhood cultures, where it's no longer a matter of honour. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back. It's no longer a matter of you hurt me, I'm going to go to the authorities and deal with it in a dignified manner. It's you hurt me, I'm going to let everyone know you've hurt me, and I'm going to seek validation in that, and I'm going to share it with the world, and I'm going to hurt you through, and we talk about cancel culture and other things, through that wider public response. And so it's an amplification of suffering and victimhood. I think, society still has layers of all of these in place. It's not a binary, yeah.
We published an essay by Russell Blackford about violence against women, and he mentioned it there that in certain cultures, for example, Asian cultures, Japan, you never want to show that you've been offended or that you've had a slight against your honor. And then other cultures, for example, and Thomas Sowell wrote about this too, in the southern states, in Black communities in the South, they had very much an honor culture, which you can see in like rap music. It glorifies, this guy looked at my girl, I'm going to come down and I'm going to show him who's the boss. Whereas in more like European cultures, if you show that you're offended, it makes you look weaker. So you actually try to look like you're above it, like, that's not offensive to me. And I was wondering whether Islam, it seems to be more of a dignity culture for men in particular, which is, if you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you publicly. And I think maybe the Cronulla riots, I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent here, but the Cronulla riots was symptomatic of that, of like white guys and Middle Eastern guys going at it. And I guess they were both showing honor culture there. I don't know.
Yeah, some interesting points. I think honor cultures tend to exist where there's less reach of government. And so, you could almost view it as, and this is a really basic proposition here, it's any sociologist listening would probably take me apart on it, but in effect, you're going to see honor cultures predominate amongst younger men, working class backgrounds, but also from newer arrivals as well, particularly from countries where government isn't strong. And so
low trust societies too, probably.
Correct. So if you look at the Cronulla riots, you had two groups of young men primarily, and a lack of potential reach into either of those by government, into those subcultures and so on. And that's where it came to a head with the back and forward of those riots. But with dignity culture, it tends to be a little bit more of you've got to have resources. You've still got to have resources to have the education to know what steps to take. You're primarily going to be middle class and, or, wealthy, and you're going to take action through the courts. Someone, again, we see it with someone defames someone or says something about someone, you threaten to sue. And again, rather, you're not going out to hurt them. You're not going out to physically confront them. You're doing it through the courts. So there's layers, and it's tied into socioeconomics, it's tied into culture and everything else. And I think aspects of Islam certainly have a strong honour bent, which ties into that conception of masculinity. And that then is particularly attractive to some young men who feel that they've been dishonoured, that they've experienced shame and humiliation, that they've been marginalised. They might feel that they've been marginalised due to racism or a deeper set of prejudices in their own country, or they might feel that Islam, in a broader sense, has been dishonoured and is under attack. And this concept of a global war on Islam is a really common trope in Islamist extremist narratives.
Yeah, and you see it when there are violent attacks in the Western world, but also in the Middle East with, Hamas attacking Israel, for example. You will see people sort of apologize for it and say, yeah, it's not right. But it is true that there's, a lot of Islamophobia, and these poor, men feel really, especially when they move to the West, they feel really discriminated against, and therefore it's sort of like the host country's fault that they're acting out like this. And for example, I was just watching a show on the Boston bombers. They were Chechenian Muslims, I believe, Chechen. And that was definitely an aspect of their motivations, that they felt very discriminated against and belittled, and it seems like they wanted to prove that they were powerful big men.
Yeah, it's an interesting case. The Boston bombers, the Sarnet brothers, I think they are. He was an excellent boxer, and I think he was an Olympic trialist, but he hadn't been selected. And that was a critical moment where he blamed racism and discrimination rather than, for example, the fact that he didn't box as well as he needed to. In many cases of radicalisation, there's a particularly pivotal moment or two where there's everything comes to a head. And what we see is that extremist narratives are really good at targeting that sense of disempowerment and shame or humiliation. They talk about, it's not your fault that you're not going anywhere in society and you're not moving up. It's not your fault that you're unemployed or you've been
no girlfriend
or committed a crime. It's the fault of the system, and the system's fundamentally skewed because there's a war on Muslims and Islam. But we see that from the extreme right. They do the exact same thing.
Same.
It's in their case, it's always the Jews who are behind the strings, and powerful elites and the left. If you go to the some of the other groups like incels, they don't have incel groups, but the narrative is that women are all inherently malevolent and only breed with 10% of men, and that 10% of men isn't you. And so, you've been discriminated against, and only by sort of taking revenge and retribution on those women can you regain that sense of manhood. So
who was the young man who shot up the sorority in the States?
Yeah, that was Elliot Rodger. That was the most prominent first sort of case. He didn't refer to himself as an incel, but he left a manifesto which has inspired numerous incels since.
Why do you think men seem to be more susceptible to extremism and political extremism than women?
It's a great question, because in so many ways it cuts to the heart of this issue of masculinity. And I refer to masculinity as the social construction of what it is to be a man. Look, there's absolutely an embodied component of manhood, and layers of chemicals and testosterone and everything else. But when we're talking about this social construction, there are expectations about what a man is, what a man should achieve and perform, what roles and so on. And in many respects, that's still a really powerful component of our culture. This sense of hyper competitivity, for example, in Australia, it's like if you're good at sport, you're on a fast track to being celebrated in society and held up as a role model, and the great pay and everything else, as opposed to being good at something else. I remember the school I went to, the music kids, were looked down upon. The sports kids were, held up and so
Jocks,
on.
yeah.
The jocks. And that's the case in many societies globally. I think
Mm-hmm.
over time things change and different things are celebrated and held up, and there's been a shift in standards. I think in our education system, other things are being valued, like musical performance and the arts a little bit more. We still live, for the most part, in a world where strength matters, where a sense of honour matters, where pride and the way you hold yourself is important. And I don't know that that's ever going to really go away. I think it's just a matter of what that looks like in practice in, say, an advanced liberal democracy
Mm-hmm.
versus a developing country where it can quite often be dog eat dog.
Do you agree that masculinity has been demonized in the West over the last decade or so?
Yeah, again, I think that's a really interesting question, because it opens up this whole idea of the manosphere, the online ecosystem where men go and talk about being emasculated and shamed, and feminists there's this really powerful backlash against feminism in these spaces. And I do a lot of work around this research too, but I do a lot of research about this stuff. But I think for me, we're a really important pivotal moment about what it is to be a man in society. Because on the one hand, we've seen over the last 50 years, decline of societal institutions, male-dominated work, this idea of the male breadwinner. You now need two incomes to own a house or even have a chance of owning a house. And if you're in Sydney, even that, you might need a third income. And so we're in a cost of living crisis. The older generation are living for longer and holding on to their assets. So there's not the relief. There's so many different demographic changes and so on. And so in that context, there's always been, on the one hand, historically, a crisis of masculinity. Every generation, there are books about young men not performing the way they should, or miscreants or deviants and so on. But we're at a point where I think there's a bit of a reckoning about what it is, because women are starting to not only do as well as men, but to surpass men in professional work. Our legislation and our protections of women's work, including, for example, paid maternity leave, anti-sexism discrimination, and so on, also reinforce and enhance women moving into the workplace. And that creates a lot of challenges for this idea, particularly of men who were raised by an older generation of parent who hold this nostalgic vision of what masculinity once was, and yet never was. It's this idea of being able to work and have a servile wife at home and so on. And I think to that extent, that's no longer possible. It's not going to occur in the way that it always did. There has been marked deep, not only institutional, but structural societal change that we need to move on from as men. On the other hand, there has absolutely been, from particularly the progressive left, objectively speaking, a demonisation of traditional sort of elements of masculinity. And I think we've got to find that happy balance. On the one hand, you can have masculine traits and contribute to society, and society can benefit from those traits. But on the other hand, some of those traits, like, this idea of a dominant male in a relationship and so on, don't work for everyone, and they're not necessarily the best way to move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think there needs to be more empathy on both sides. And I think if you're a humanist, which I am, and, are all about human flourishing, I think I've always thought, well, not always, because I used to be pretty radical Marxist feminist back in the day. But now since I've seen the light, I see that happy, healthy men are good for women, because happy, mentally healthy men do not want to harm people. They don't want to harm their wives. They don't want to harm their children. They want to protect them. And I think men inherently have always been protectors of women and children. It's not to say they, haven't failed at that sometimes, but men are protective people in general, more protective than women. And there's reasons for that, because you're bigger and you've got that testosterone and you're more willing to risk your life for women. And I think that's something beautiful to celebrate that about men, that they have that role. And I think that unfortunately it's been demonized, and men seem to find themselves in a position of not knowing where they stand in society.
Yeah, no, I think it's in particular a certain type of man who gets particularly perturbed by this, though, as well. I think most men get on with their lives and aren't necessarily engaged in any of these debates. They might be a little bit cynical about some of the framing of manhood and toxic masculinity. I think that's one that probably stabs every guy a little bit, just to annoys us all. I think most men are just out there working, getting on with their lives, with their families or loved ones and partners, whatever their persuasion, and focused on doing something and building something for their families and themselves. But those people who are particularly caught up in this are people who spend a lot of time online. Yeah, they're the ones who are commenting on every post.
I know them.
And we're talking probably 5 to 10% of the population. And they're men primarily who feel like they're a little bit static in life. To me, social trajectory is really important, because if you feel like you're capable or society is enabling you to build a better life for yourself, you're much more inclined to get on with it and to have something to look forward to. But when you're kind of stagnant, or you're even slightly feel like the rug's coming out from under you, and no matter what you're doing, you can't move ahead, then you're more inclined to be drawn into this world, but also to voice strong opinions. And I think what we've seen over time is that as there is greater inequality in society, but also some of these structural changes have become more marked, there's less places for men to find solidarities with other men as well, then we've seen more and more men get caught in this world and are looking for something. And it's not always the best and most productive voices that they're listening to.
So what do you think are the most effective policy changes that we could make? Maybe not just policy, but also make in the home, in the personal and political life. What can we do to make things better?
Oh, that's a big question. I think there's layers again. I think let's start with sort of the dark side of what's going on and then move to the positives. And I think the dark side is we have to recognise that there's a really powerful backlash at the moment going on against women and women's rights and so on, and in particular amongst younger men. And my own research demonstrates that over the last 5 years, there's been a significant shift in hardline misogynistic attitudes amongst some young men. And we're seeing Andrew Tates and we're seeing others emerge to not only exploit that because it's a marketplace out there where they're making money, but also we're seeing extremist actors, Nazis, religious extremists and others, seeking to capitalise on that. So we need to acknowledge that masculinity is an important element of that attraction, and we need to work on, alternative narratives and engagement there, as well as socioeconomic change. That's the negative. But if you're looking
Before we go on, briefly, can you give a brief outline of how you define misogyny and what are some classic misogynistic tropes that you've studied?
Yeah, so misogyny really is anti-women prejudice at the end of the day. And look, everyone to some extent, and women internalise it as well, hold sort of anti-women prejudice in their mindset or frame. And you might catch yourself doing it, or you might just hold that perspective. But it's there. Like most people hold prejudice against other races, other sexualities. It's always going to be there. It's about identifying it. But when I use, and I've developed this with some colleagues, this idea of soft and hard misogyny to better differentiate. So hard misogyny, for example, if you're against normative social propositions like women deserve equal rights to men, then you're a hard misogynist. Like the idea that women don't deserve the exact same opportunities, life and rights, you're probably ideologically motivated in that prejudice. Then there's a broader soft misogyny, which is, well, women are equal, but. And so the measure that I use there in one of my surveys is rights for women have gone too far. And then you interview and you dig into it. So it's the idea that, well, women are equal to men, but now they're getting a better playing field than men. And there's too much change in their favour. And so
I might be self-misogynist by those standards.
Well, it's funny because women in Australia in particular, many women are. We're talking up to almost 30%. But we're saying hard misogynists, we're talking about up to 5% of the population, but it's increased significantly. I think it's close to 10 amongst younger men. But then soft misogyny, we're talking 35, 40% of the population, men and women. And so you have to unpack that and you have to seek to understand, well, why are people holding this position? What is it that's shaping their particular lives that they would hold these perspectives? Is there something to it? And my job as a scholar isn't to judge, it's to actually objectively engage with what I'm seeing and to engage with theory to understand that. So that's misogyny, and that's the negative side of things, is that we're seeing a backlash. And we're seeing a backlash to feminism. And I think feminism is why we are where we are, with women having equal rights and being in the workplace and so on. And we need to acknowledge that that's had good societal gain and benefit. And it certainly opened up the economy and stimulated growth. I think the key challenge, though, is what is it about this particular set of circumstances? And I really think it's deeply inscribed in socioeconomics, people feeling like they're not able to build a better life for themselves anymore, that they're looking for something to understand that. And then you've got loud voices being amplified on social media saying all men are toxic. Well, that's the obvious enemy, right? Easier to blame that than it is to understand deeper structural factors. So I think that's the dark component, and we need to really work more to engage young men in particular around some of these issues, because older men were less likely to hold anti-women views, funnily enough, more likely to be anti-minority, but less likely to be anti-women. And I think anyone who's been married and had kids is probably, to some extent, grown up a little bit from that. But then you go to the positives and the constructive side. I think, in a way, there's an opportunity to look at, well, have that conversation about what masculinity is and what it can be. And I think in that context, we're talking, not to get too academic, I'll talk about pro-social masculinity, this idea that you can be a man and have masculine attributes and even engage in violence, be it hunting, fishing, all forms of violence, according to us academics, and to engage in traditionally male activities, but also contribute as a citizen. You can engage in society and treat women with respect, treat others who just aren't like you with respect, and allow others to be different without having to impose yourself on them, and be a really powerful, productive, contributing member of society without having to effectively distance yourself from these attributes. And I think that's where I think the conversation needs to also look at, is we need to allow people to be who they are.
Yeah, and my very non-academic take on this is that actually I think that's the most masculine thing. When you see that a guy is very easily upset by things, that's not very attractive, because it shows weakness. It shows that he's easily flustered by whether someone's gay or whether someone's, like, I think that peak masculinity for me, and thankfully my fiance embodies this, is that he doesn't care what other people do or how they live their lives or whatever. He focuses on himself and on me and providing for us, and he isn't easily upset or offended by the lives of others. Men who easily get into fights at pubs because someone looks at them the wrong way or someone talks to their girlfriend or something, that shows a weakness, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and an insecurity. I also talk a lot about in my work about anger.
Yes.
And that's a critical element of the attraction to extremism. But it's not, anger by itself is actually a very human trait and characteristic and emotion. And so we all experience anger. And whenever I give this as a sort of lecture or training, whatever, I ask who's been angry, and I always put my hand up first. And what's driven your anger? For me, it's sitting in traffic. I hate traffic with a passion. And anger leads to hate, right? But on the other hand, anger can be a really positive driving force for social change. Anger, like righteous anger at inequality, or a righteous anger at other people being treated poorly, can drive social change. So it's important that we understand we can't reject these elements of what it is to be human. Anger is actually an important human emotion, and we all feel it. But again, there's this culture, particularly it was becoming predominant, where any expression of anger was seen as a negative trait and so on. And we need to get back to moving away from, again, this victimhood culture because there are victims. Absolutely, there are victims in society, and we need to go into bat for them. But when everyone's proclaiming victimhood and putting their hand up, saying, you spoke to me aggressively, or these microaggressions and so on, then we've kind of got to grow up as a society and move on, and get back to ultimately the fact that we're all human and we all experience a range of emotion. We all feel insecure about things at times. We all feel a little bit worried and anxious about our futures in some way, shape, or form, and what's going on in the world. And really, it might come across as a motherhood statement, but we need to find our common humanity again. And in particular, social media has just created tribes, online tribes, and where people go and live in their echo chambers and don't experience face-to-face interaction and develop those relationships that are critical to human progress.
Definitely. Where do you think a lot of this radicalization is happening? Because just an anecdote, a friend of a friend, his son is getting bullied via text message by another boy at school. They're about 14. My friend's son is Jewish, and this boy is saying despicable stuff like, I wish you all died in the gas chambers in World War II. They should have finished you off then. My fiance actually experienced similar bullying like this when he was at school a few decades ago now. But I'm just wondering, where on earth is that kid getting these ideas from? I suspect that they'd have to be coming from online, unless his family is that crazy that they're talking about this stuff at home. I sort of predict that more of it is happening online. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so in violent extremism research, I think we're moving away from looking purely at online communities. That's a critical component, people getting online. And so refer to technological affordances of social media. Anonymity, for example. You can say and do anything and not be held to account. And extremists exploit that daily. But also anonymity leads to disinhibition. It leads to a more vitriolic discourse where people will say and do anything just to shock and offend, and people don't even experience or feel it anymore. And that's critical, and there's a lot of work done around that. But it's also important to understand the offline factors. We know, based on my own research at least, that masculinities are most primarily formed by that father attachment and peers, close peers in face-to-face in real time.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Josh.